Welcome to the Euro Express with me, your host, Kevin Turley. On this show, we climb aboard the Euro Express to visit different European locations where we talk to people living there about their lives and their faith. It's as if we're hurtling through Europe in the dining compartment of the Orient Express with good food and even better conversation. So, all aboard the Euro Express. Hello, today the Euro Express heads to Rome, where we collect the British author and poet Sally Reid. We then head back to Brussels, Belgium, where we meet Dr Amal Marogy, who is an academic and also a social entrepreneur. Sally and Amal, welcome on board the Euro Express.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you, thank you.
Amal, if I could start with you, Belgium, Brussels. The thing that keeps coming up about Belgium at the moment is its euthanasia law. If there's one headline that keeps making the headlines, it's around euthanasia. It gives a rather skewed view of Belgium. What do you make of it?
I think it's very unfortunate because I've known Belgium at its best. When I started studying here at university, you could choose, a mass from the morning, from 6:30 in the morning till 7 o'clock in the evening. Like there was nearly a mass every half an hour there. Belgians love Our Lady. So if you come and visit any Flemish city or I think especially Flemish cities, you will see nearly in every corner beautiful statues of Our Lady. So they love Our Lady. They love St. Joseph, so it's a very Catholic country, but something happened in the last 20 years that made this country lose its faith. And this is, it's a mystery. There are reasons, of course, for it, but it is very sad to see. It's very, very sad to see. So euthanasia, I'm not surprised. It's just when you lose faith, when you don't understand the purpose of suffering, why we suffer, why we are here on earth. The logical thing that you would do, you just think, I don't want to see, especially a little child suffering. So you get very emotional and you are thinking that you're helping them out of the pain and suffering, So you think that you are doing something good for them. So many people really think that they are doing something good. And also, I think that there is this mentality of if it is legal, if it's in the law, then it is good. So really, what is good is now defined by what the law defines as good and not whether something is good in itself, whether the law says it is good or not good, But no, whatever the law says, that if there's a law allowing or permitting anything, then for people now, it's a sign that it is good.
Yeah.
So,
Sally, you're in Italy at the moment. Italy, again, headlines from Italy in the last months have all been dominated by health issues. The COVID-19 crisis came to northern Italy first in Europe and was very prominent throughout the world. What's the situation like today?
Well, the Italians are being amazingly compliant with mask wearing. But as far as and generally with rules in general, I would say, but in terms of going to mass, etc., things are pretty much back to normal, aside from the masks. And we're kind of on the brink of sliding back into more restrictions. So it's been a time of great anxiety, and I think the Italians have had to adapt and behave in ways that they're not used to. I mean, all the baci, all the kissing and the hugs, etc., that's all had to go out the window. Yes. And I'm amazed actually at how compliant the Italians have been with all of that. So it feels like a much more sober place at the moment.
Now, Sally, you are an English woman originally, from East Anglia, I believe, and you're now living in very much Catholic Italy. You went from a very secular, nominally Protestant country to the centre of the Catholic world, Rome, Italy. Did you notice anything in particular that was particularly Catholic or particularly springing from that source, which the English, the British, have lost somehow?
Well, interestingly, I think that a lot of this stems from Mary and the loss of Mary, because of course, when we divorced from the Catholic Church, we took on Anglicanism, and we really lost the devotion to Mary. And I think that that central feminine core of the church, and that the essence of femininity and the essence of the mother, that's something that in Britain we've really lost to our detriment. And I think that we see ourselves as very compassionate, and we see ourselves as a very tolerant nation. But I think, as Amal was just saying, we see that the avoidance of suffering is something to be pursued at any price. And in fact, it's what happens when we avoid suffering is we end up running into more suffering. And I think that we don't know how to deal with suffering, real suffering, and how to deal with real emotion in Britain. That's a bit of a problem. And I think perhaps in Italy and in kind of Catholic countries, you have that deep compassion that is Mary, because Mary, our mother, embodies compassion more than anybody else, because she is the person who feels Christ's passion the most.
Yes.
So when you cast her out of Christianity in the Christian picture, then you lose something really enormous. And that manifests itself in all kinds of ways. Sorry, but I mean, the food is huge. I mean, in Italy, food is almost like the second religion. It's a national obsession. And as an Englishwoman, I really can't understand it. But I think you do lose something when you lose the emphasis on food in life.
That's really interesting. Would you say then that the COVID crisis has sort of accentuated that idea that Catholic Italy, for all its issues and suffering around COVID, is dealing with it better than the UK at the moment? Would you say?
I don't know, because I think this is a very complicated thing. Because I think if you simply look at cases of COVID, that you don't see the whole picture, because I think it really depends a lot on who's testing the most. So I don't think anybody can judge yet who's done it best and who's done it worst.
Yeah.
I can only say that I think the church has dealt with things a little differently. I know that in Britain the churches were just shut, and in Italy I think it was possible, if you were in the middle of a city, it was possible to walk to a church and go inside. So I believe. I'm not in that position, because for me to go anywhere, I have to drive out of the place where I live, and I was stopped at the end of the road by the carabinieri saying, "Where are you going?"
Wow.
And if it wasn't to the supermarket, I had to go back. So but I think on the whole, the churches they kind of managed to stay more open to the people in Italy, which I think is a very good thing.
Amal, in Brussels, in Belgium, what's the situation at the moment, and what's the reaction around public worship?
In Brussels, there are still some churches. I think that most churches are still open, and there are some masses as well. What I know about Flanders, it's very difficult to find a mass. I mean, daily mass, it's a struggle. It is where my mother is living. We had daily masses. There are many churches, but most churches are closed. Thank God we have a shrine of Our Lady, very old shrine. I think dates back to the 16th century. It's open. There's no mass anymore there, but it's incredible. Sally was saying something about Our Lady. You don't see many people now going to mass on Sundays. But my goodness, if you stay in that chapel, you will see people from all walks of life, all ages. Men, women, young, old, grandparents, parents, who will just stop there and light a candle to Our Lady. It's very, very moving. Maybe people who don't go to mass anymore, but they still have that love for Our Lady, which is incredible. I mean, it's really very nice to see. So, thank God we have that shrine of Our Lady, and it's keeping the faith alive.
So, Amal, would you agree with what Sally was saying about Catholic nations have a greater devotion to Our Lady, and it slightly changes the tone of each nation?
Yes. I can't imagine Belgium without Our Lady surviving. I mean, the faith in Belgium without Our Lady surviving for much longer. But it's, when you see these people coming to Our Lady naturally without, sometimes it's just to learn, because they know that if they need something, they will go to their mother. That's what they have learned. Yeah. And when you see people in their 60s, 70s, or even 50, 40 coming and lighting and just sitting 10 minutes, but really praying to Our Lady and asking her for favors, or maybe, just being there to find that peace of mind they are looking for it's quite incredible. Like it's very hard, as I said, like to live as a Catholic nowadays, especially when you cannot worship. It is very difficult to find mass.
Yes.
And you are not guaranteed always to find a valid mass. Masses change according to the priest who's celebrating. But when you see these people coming, you just think that there's something that they cannot kill. If you have such a deep love and veneration for Our Lady, it's very, very difficult to uproot. So that's really, I think, is the hope for a country like Belgium.
Now, Amal, you've lived in England for quite some time, for a number of years, and Sally's gone the other way. She's gone from a nominally Protestant, secular culture to a very Catholic one. You've gone from a Catholic country to a Protestant one. Did you notice that sort of shift? Did you sense that shift when you moved?
One of the funny things that happened to me when I arrived in London and I went to the Victoria and Albert Museum. So I saw the huge statue of Queen Victoria. I started saying Hail Mary, thinking that it was Our Lady, because that's what you are used to. Because, I didn't think twice, because this is what you are used to in Belgium. Like any statue, you don't think, like you go to town halls, anywhere, so any statue you see of a woman, that is a statue of Our Lady. So I said, oh my gosh, I'm really impressed to find a statue of Our Lady that big. And they said, no, that's Queen Victoria, actually. I said, oh.
which kind of maybe shows the priorities of the country, who knows?
Yeah, but there are things that really impressed, I'm still impressed about England. One of them, that is for me, living history, when Pope Benedict came for the beatification and we were in Hyde Park on our knees in the place where Catholic martyrs were martyred. Right. And we were there on our knees before the Blessed Sacrament with the Pope and the English police protecting us. Yeah. You just think, my goodness. And there is this sign, I think it's in the Tyburn convent, when someone said, I can't remember the name of the blessed, or I think it's the blessed who said, one day this place will be a place of adoring the Blessed Sacrament.
Yes.
I remember seeing...
Which it is.
And for me, that was really living history. I just thought, I can die in peace after seeing that. It is... You're lucky, I'm not English, I'm not part of it, but, it was a present from God, and it's quite amazing. When I see that I'm on the receiving end of all these prayers and suffering of these English martyrs, it's the church, you just see we are a family, no matter where you are, it's the same church, the same family.
Sally, were you a Catholic by the time Pope Benedict visited Great Britain?
It was the year of my conversion. So I watched it with an eye to thinking that I would soon be Catholic. So I viewed it in a slightly different way.
I often wonder what it's like, Sally, to grow up in England, to be an English woman with the established view of history, the established church, the established society, and then to have that upended. I'm assuming it's upended once you become a Catholic, because suddenly places like Tyburn start to reveal a sort of secret history, or am I over-imagining?
I'm a product of the 1970s and 90s, 80s education, and we weren't taught history. Seriously, we weren't taught about Ireland, we weren't taught about the colonies, we weren't taught about the Reformation. My education was a disaster. I don't know if that was kind of unique to my particular situation, but we weren't taught huge amounts. So in a sense, it's been a question of informing myself. But we've neglected terribly our own history and our own sense of religion and our own church, because none of that was taught to me. It's hard to answer. Everything I've learned since I left school.
Do you have a sneaking suspicion, Sally, that once you start discovering things like the martyrs, like Tyburn, that certain aspects of history have been hidden or erased even by the establishment?
Yeah, I think that what I said illustrates that, the fact that they don't teach about things like the colonization of Ireland. They do erase things, and they don't. They really have an agenda in what they teach. And I think it would be wonderful to have a very, very balanced look at history all the way through. so that, of course, the victor always writes history. But wouldn't it be wonderful if we could hear about all sides and both sides and really explore things in a proper and moderate way? Because we just don't tend to do that.
Absolutely. Now, Amal, you're involved in something very close to that, but much more modern, which is that your homeland of Iraq, people have tried to obliterate all reference to the Christian past, the quite ancient Christian past of Iraq. And you're involved in trying to help restore that in some fashion. Is that correct?
Yes, it is a seed that has been planted by my grandmother. You know, I really love grandparents in a very particular way because I think that they are very much neglected, and I would love to see more grandparents being beatified and canonized. You know, anyway, you know, like I owe a lot to my grandmother, and she was, you know, she didn't have any formal education, but my goodness, she mastered Aramaic, and she was a poet. She could produce verses in no time. And, you know, like, just to go back to you, Sally, you know, there's the Magnificat. A lot of people, you know, like, I've heard it so many times in academic circles when they say, you know, like, that's definitely not Our Lady who has produced something like that. It's very theological. It's St. Luke who put it in his, you know, like, in the mouth of Our Lady. And it's like, no. You don't know, you know, like, I've seen biblical women. I was surrounded by women like Our Lady, and my grandmother was one of them, but she wasn't the only one. It's incredible, and people like her, they knew their faith. They had very strong memory, very good memory, and they could produce 10 Magnificats. So it's not strange at all when, you know, like, when you start interpreting without knowing the background, it is very, very difficult. So that's something that I would like to say, yes, Our Lady wrote, I mean, she said the Magnificat, because I've seen women like Our Lady producing Magnificats, many Magnificats as well, because they loved God and they knew the Bible. So she was the one who was very concerned about us forgetting our heritage. And, you know, when you are persecuted all your life, it's the oral tradition, and it's the parents and grandparents who will teach the children about their past. And just to go back again to what Sally was referring to, you don't learn anything, nothing about history at school, or they give you the version of history that they want you to learn. When I was 14, I still remember my uncle giving me an old book of history, you know, that belonged to my other uncle, and he said, this is the true history that I want you to read. So at the age of 13 or 14, I started reading the history, and it was history of Europe, history of the Middle East, and the Kurdish people, you know. Anyway, it is very important. So I've, in a way, you know, that seed has been planted, and at university I just thought, yeah, I can see what my grandmother was talking about. It is now up to me to fulfill that mission. So it's really a mission. I want to do the same thing for the next generation in my family, and also for my country. We have a Christian heritage. It's a very rich heritage. It is, I won't say it's a sad heritage, you know, like, we have a lot of persecution. It's a history of loss, of persecution, of displacement, but also it is an unknown history of faith, of forgiveness, of trust in God, trust in God's providence, and especially love. You know, we never considered our persecutors as our enemies. My parents and grandparents never told us how much they suffered because of them. It was just, you know, this is what we suffered. And we loved our neighbors. You know, we were surrounded by Muslim neighbors. We were surrounded by people who couldn't understand us. When I was at school, you know, like you, I faced the first, you know, incident of persecution at the age of 5, honestly. But I was proud of it, you know, like, and I never thought that I would hate my teacher simply because she wasn't treating me properly. And this is what I'm really grateful. So, you know, when we are talking about culture, for me, it's not only about the language and about the heritage and all churches and manuscripts, but also it is the spirit behind it. And that's why I'm so passionate about preserving that culture, because I want it to be intact, and not only to look at it on, you know, like, as dead manuscripts or buildings that you need to preserve because they are old. No, it is not because they are old. It is because they tell us a very important story that we need to hear and the world needs to hear.
Sally, do you hear echoes in what Amal's saying for the European situation today, where people are trying to obliterate the Christian past in so many different ways? Do you see an echo? Or hear
It
an
does
echo?
feel as though things are being very much pushed under the carpet, and things are changing very rapidly. And it's of course it's always hard to generalize. I mean, I've lived in Italy for a long time, but I live in one place and I have one life. But I'm just aware of the fact that, in my daughter's class, people are there's a very, there's a big tendency to be very anti-Catholic and anti-church, and she feels it very acutely.
Really?
And it's, and she feels there haven't been any incidents of overt persecution, but she's felt that she's had to stand up for things and, stand up for her faith, and she's constantly aware of people saying nasty things about Catholics, which is amazing considering we live so close to Rome. So things are changing at a staggering pace. And I think in terms of, preserving history, I really hear what you say, and I think literature has a huge role to play in preserving history. I mean, I've been reading a lot of Anna Akhmatova and Shalamov, who wrote about the gulags, and all of those things, they almost defied being described. The suffering was so awful, but they felt this call to try and express things in words, and it was only through that those things can actually sustain and can be passed on to the next generation. So, as a writer, I feel, we have a duty to write things down and a duty to preserve things.
Is there something in that as well, Sally? You're a poet, obviously an award-winning poet, and there's something in what Amal's talking about an oral tradition, which is true of all cultures if you go back far enough. And I often think poetry and that oral tradition are quite close. Would you agree?
Yeah. Oh, they definitely are. And I think, the oral tradition, was only, I assume it's only been lost through the printing press and through technology. We don't need it. And also because we haven't been persecuted. We haven't needed it because we haven't had our manuscripts destroyed and we haven't been censored. But that can change very, very quickly because people are being censored, more and more in Europe. There's certain things you just can't say. If you ask somebody like J.K. Rowling, you take an enormous risk in stating some basic truths these days. So we may well find that we do have to begin memorizing what we're writing down. But that oral tradition has departed massively from the poetry of the last few hundred years because of the printing press. But I think, what's wonderful about Christianity is the fact that obviously the Bible is made up of stacks and stacks of poetry, and that makes it easier to remember, it makes it easier to quote. The images are so vivid, it's all so much easier to pass on. Of course, there's reason behind that, there's divine wisdom in that.
Amal, you're very lucky in a sense that you grew up in a biblical land, that your family, I mean, you just said there your grandmother learned how to speak Aramaic, which is the language of our Lord. I mean, when you pick up the Bible and you read the Bible in whichever language, do you feel much closer to it because of the kind of geographic and historical link?
Yes, I do. So that's why I say when I read something like the Magnificat, I immediately think of my grandmother. It's a story that comes alive, and Saint Joseph. When you know a little bit about the Middle East and the situation that a woman could find herself as Our Lady, and then Saint Joseph and all the privilege and the power he would have had, but then when he tries to leave her secretly, what does that mean? He's going to be the one to be blamed. He was really sacrificing himself and his reputation to protect the protection of Our Lady. So when you read that, you just think, I wish I could explain that to people as well, how great St. Joseph is and what he was doing. He's really a model for every man, and what else? Things that happen with Jesus. I remember, for example, there is one particular scene in the Bible where I just get sometimes, when Jesus says he addresses Our Lady as woman, what does it have to do with you and me? And everyone said, so they try to find every sort of, they start excuses why Jesus is saying that. But, it is something that we do very much when you're talking to your mother and she asks you something. You know, it's just not the right moment. And you just think, oh gosh, you know, like, and then they will call her a woman. So it's the way that we do it. And then they will say, yeah, you know, women, leave me alone, you know, but it's not because you don't like
No,
her.
there's no disrespect.
And mothers immediately know that it's a yes.
Yes.
So they won't say anything. So, you know, there are really these bits of in the Bible where you just think, yes, I know it because I lived it. So I'm really lucky.
No,
And
I would like to pose a question to both of you, because both of you independently have mentioned Our Lady, and I'm speaking to, as you know, from Walsingham, which is the chief Marian shrine to Our Lady in England. One of the questions that sometimes comes up is, what relevance can Mary, Our Lady, have to the modern woman in Europe today, with the presumption that she has no relevance? And I'd like to ask each of you individually, how do you respond to that as a modern 21st century woman? Sally, how do you respond?
Well, I respond that Mary is the most powerful woman in the history of the world. That's the first thing, is that people assume that she's this incredibly shy, you know, timid, submissive woman. And that's not the point. Her courage was absolutely phenomenal. It was what she had to do. That the scene of the Annunciation, when she's asked to do this enormous thing for God, and what she was then asked to do through her life in terms of having this extraordinary child. And any mother will know that having an extraordinary child is not an easy thing or a particularly desirable thing. You know, you really want normality. And then, of course, his mission, and then we know that she wasn't kind of included in the way we might expect in his mission. And then, of course, the cross, which doesn't even bear thinking about. So we know that Mary had to do things that were beyond what we could humanly expect to be able to do. And yet she said yes, and she even sang the Magnificat. So her courage was born of this extraordinary faith. And I see her as this woman who's just at the human level, incredibly brave and incredibly strong and powerful in a hidden way in God. Now, there's a couple of points here. The first is that when we think of power, when feminists think of power these days, they think about wanting to be like men in a society that's already constructed along capitalist lines. Okay, so to me, feminism's got it all back to front, because why do we want to be like men? Why do we want to prop up a capitalist society? Now, I'm not criticizing capitalism, but what I'm saying is that by saying you're a feminist in the 21st century, by default, you're saying, I think that society is great and I want to be a big part of it. Well, I think there's a lot wrong with society, and I don't want to be working like a man in a man's way, in a man's field. I think we should be looking at how women can be women and truly change society in a meaningful way. So I think feminists have got it all upside down. It's not about the kind of power that we think is important, which is all to do with money and economics. We should be looking at the power of motherhood, the power of love, the power of being humble, and the power of really working for the common good, which is something we've completely lost the plot on. Okay, and then of course the other thing with Mary is that people really don't understand Mary theologically, because we've lost our bearings in religious terms. So if you look at Mary in the driest terms of, okay, she's the mother of God, which is hardly a dry story, but if you just take it at that, and you don't look at the Old Testament and the fact that Mary is prefigured all the way through the Old Testament, second only to Jesus, okay? She's the ground on which the incarnation is planted. She's absolutely essential. She's the essential part of the chain between God and man, by which God could live with us.
Yeah.
So the idea that she's somehow marginal or subservient or not important, or that she's submissive in the wrong way, is just so wrong and upside down, and is really the seat and the core of all of our pain and all of our struggles. And as women, we've got it so wrong. We've got it so wrong, because we just seem to want to be sitting on the board in a company. Well, you know, it's not that it's wrong to want that, but if we want change, we shouldn't be looking to be just like men.
Yes.
That's what I think.
Amal, how would you respond to the question? What is the relevance of Our Lady today in the Middle East, in Europe, to modern women?
She's a model. I think that Our Lady is just teaching us that we don't have to be relevant to be, you know, like Our Lady lived her life. She lived her mission. She was the woman. She was doing what every woman would do in her place, but she was full of grace. So that's why she, she couldn't care. She wasn't there to try and live up to that vocation because she has to do it. She was just doing what every woman would do. So I think that in the Middle East, at least, there is this respect for a mother, like whether you are Muslim, Jew, or Christian. Just because you are a mother, you are a very special person, very, very special. Our Lady is a mother, but at the same time, because she's a woman, we know, maybe you won't believe it because many people think that women in the Middle East, they are oppressed, they don't have much to say, but actually they have a lot to say. And at least in my family, like within our communities, women have a lot to say and they have the final word. We always say the women decide and men will announce the decision. So, but just growing up as a woman, a Catholic woman in the Middle East, I've learned that it is a privilege to be a woman because Our Lady is really the second after God. There's only God, and then you have Our Lady, and then the angels and everyone. And just because she's a woman, like I'm a woman as well, I don't have to be special. I don't have to be relevant. It's just enough to be a woman and live your mission as a woman. And when I was studying, every time that I had, a crisis because of my exams, or I wasn't sure anymore if I'm going to pass my exam, I still remember an aunt of mine would come and say, "Why are you worried? You're a woman. If you study, it's okay. If you don't study, if you don't have a degree, it's not a big issue. A man needs a degree, but a woman doesn't." It was really just encouraging me. It was just, you're a woman. You don't need it. It is something that you can do or you don't do. You have that freedom. And that's what makes, it made me always feel that I'm special. I have more opportunity to choose. And I never felt that I was less because of Our Lady. It is not someone that I'm aspiring to imitate because she's done great things. I'm imitating her because she is a woman. She's a great woman. That's all.
So, Amal, if we were to take that particular insight and apply it to your work, which is about cultural restoration, both in Europe and in Iraq, how does that play out? How does that influence the choices, the decisions, even the projects or the things that you're trying to restore?
When I went back to Iraq after many, many years, the typical thing that they would do is to have every notable person in the village, and they were all men except me. I was the only woman, with all these venerable men listening to me. And we were discussing projects and everything. And then in the end, someone told me, "Look, my daughter, I tell you something. You want to achieve something in this village, go and talk to women. If you can convince the women here, the project will succeed. If you cannot, no matter what you do, because if the woman is not convinced and if she doesn't see any future for her family, the family will be leaving the village very soon." So I didn't need to think twice because I knew that that was going to happen. But I just thought, after so many years, after nearly 20 years leaving the country, so I'm going to do the same thing that everyone else is doing. But here I was sent back by men themselves to say, actually, it is not for us to decide. It's really for women to decide what to do. It is just women as powerful as that, So they will be the ones, of course, for everything official. And I still remember the woman that I was working with, incredible woman. And they said, it's very difficult for us to go and do all the official things because of the culture that they are living in. But frankly, they are just amazing. If you see any Christian, at least village, but I know that also among Muslim women there are, and Arab women, they are such powerful characters, women who are keeping everything, together, but from behind the scenes.
Yeah.
Literally from behind the scenes. So that's what I've seen. This is how I work. And again, go back to Our Lady, and every single woman that I met there is so close to Our Lady. So you think that you are being clever and you have learned so much, and then you come back to the same woman. So amazing. I would tell you, I went to New York. I've been to top universities. I even went once to Oslo, for the first time. I really felt, I don't see so much signs of God, I mean, I was missing something. I still remember going around the corner, and suddenly I saw this mosaic of Our Lady of Mother of the Church there. And, just you feel suddenly that you are home.
Yeah.
Frankly, it was like, my gosh, like I'm home, I'm fine. I was,
Yes.
I can't describe it. I don't know how to describe it, but that's the way.
Absolutely. Sally, would you say Italy is more matriarchal than Britain today in terms of its construction?
There is a matriarchal angle to Italy, certainly, but the family is changing. But I think perhaps historically, even until very, very recently, the mother had a lot of power in just that way. And yeah, I mean, Italy, if you, to use this terminology, which isn't necessarily the right terminology, Italy is kind of behind Britain in that sense, in the sense that, women were only allowed into the Carabinieri, which is the police force here. It's relatively recently, like in the last, I think, 20 years, that they've been allowed in to the Carabinieri. So things are kind of changing in a slow way. And I think that the mother at home holds a lot of power. And I think what I'd like to add is that we're talking a lot about women, but when I think about feminism and I think about the church and all the rest of it, I think another tragedy that's unfolding, particularly in Britain, is that I think that young men are being neglected enormously, because there's so much emphasis on women and women's rights and what women need and the promotion of women. I think recently I saw on the news there was a theatre company going around performing Shakespeare to schools, and they were using all female actors. So, Macbeth was played by a woman and Hamlet was played by a woman. And my response to that is, that's just awful. That's just absolutely terrible, because we're robbing men of their masculinity. And this is what's really wrong with what's going on. It's not just that we're taking femininity away from women, we're actually taking masculinity away from men.
Okay, so I don't disagree with that, but how does Our Lady then, going back to Our Lady, how could Our Lady help young men find their masculinity, their true masculinity?
Well, I think Mary's primary role is to bring people to Jesus, and Jesus is equally a very much forgotten figure in much of Britain, and I think that I notice it's creeping in Italy as well, that men don't go to church as much as women, and in Britain there's there are many young boys, I think, who have never heard of Jesus Christ. And I think if they would understand, Mary would be the one to bring them to Jesus, because he's a man, obviously, and God sent a man. He didn't choose to send a woman. He didn't choose to send somebody in between. He chose to send a man. So Christianity is a very masculine and a very feminine religion.
Amal, do you see echoes of that in the Middle East with the way the cultures are constructed historically?
Yes and no, but I think that also depends on families, on the background, who you are. All I can say, at least in my case, we've never been brought up with the either or. It is Our Lady or St. Joseph or Jesus. It was all one,
Yes.
I mean, I couldn't separate Our Lady from St. Joseph, and I couldn't separate St. Joseph from Jesus, and I couldn't separate Jesus from Our Lady and St. Joseph. So there was this unity. I think that the problem with us now is we are thinking always either or. Is it Our Lady? Is it St. Joseph? Is it Jesus? Is it this? Is it that? Is it the church? Is it God? So it is this schizophrenic attitude that we are finding ourselves in our atmosphere that is making it difficult for everyone, frankly, to live their femininity and masculinity. So it is difficult for everyone, because there is something going on which is not right. We have to choose all the time, but it's not because there are choices in front of us that we that they are just natural, but we create somehow a situation where we cannot be whole. So it is, we've become like pigeonholed in life, like we cannot have a full life. It is all sorts of compartments and things, and you cannot get that and like it is, Our Lady is and mother and virgin, like God, and I think that it was Vittorio Missori who described it very well in one of his books, and he said, this is really very Catholic. It is God is one and Trinity. Our Lady is, and so if you go through the whole thing, the Church is and human and divine, and you go through the whole litany of what he calls and. And I think that the problem with us now is that we've lost that. We've frankly lost that. We have now the litany of either or. And if you see it, that is also reflected in society. We cannot, I don't know why we are depriving ourselves from that luxury when it is offered to us, when life is offering us that option, and we just reject it for one reason or another.
Now, it's an interesting point that, because I'm very conscious that both of you are women who grew up in one country and now live in another country. And that sort of sense of not one or other, but something and. Does that play out? I'm thinking also of Our Lady, again, the example of Our Lady, the flight into Egypt. She was living in a foreign culture. The Holy Family was living in a foreign culture for a while. I mean, the whole business of refugees today, the whole business of displacement today is very much to the fore of the political agenda. But there's something on a very human level about living in a culture which isn't your own. And having to fit in, having to assimilate. And I just wonder if there's any insights either of you have in terms of Our Lady's ability to help with that.
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, speaking for myself, I think that, being an immigrant is one of the most humbling things that can possibly happen to you, because when you end up in a different country and you don't speak the language and you don't understand the culture, nobody understands how intelligent you might be or what you've done in the past. You can't make jokes. I still can't make jokes in Italian. Really? My daughter tells me off because they're completely unfunny. So it's just mortifying. It's literally mortifying. You can't fit in. And I think some people are much more gifted at assimilating. I'm not, because I'm very English, and to me language is incredibly important, and language shapes who I am. If you speak in a different language, you're not just changing the words, you're taking on a whole different mindset. And I find that very difficult to do. I mean, to go back to my daughter, she's bilingual and she's got two different personas for speaking Italian and speaking English. So it's very difficult to do. And this deep sort of discomfort at living in a different place has enormous ramifications on a person's mental health. And they actually did a study, it's fascinating, of the people of Chernobyl who were forcibly rooted out of Chernobyl after the accident happened. And a small group of them actually went back and they resettled. They were called self-settlers, and they settled in the place that was so toxic with radiation. It was deeply, the animals were just dropping dead from radiation, and the plants were just strange colors, etc. And then they went back years later and they looked at the mortality rates of those women who'd gone back to live in the place that was so dangerous, and the women who'd been forced to move to a different country. And the people that had gone back to Chernobyl actually outlived the people who'd been forced out. Wow. So they actually concluded that forcible exile is worse for your health than radiation. So I'm sorry, that's very gloomy.
well.
But I want to make the point, and there's a point to this. I think that, yes, it is a kind of a tremendous mortification, and I take it in a spiritual sense. You have to become incredibly humble. You have to become incredibly modest, and you're really pruned down to what you are in the barest essence of yourself. And you can only really pay attention to God's gaze. You have to live in God's gaze. Yeah. And I think that's something that Mary can obviously help us with, because she went through it.
Yeah.
She was the foreigner, and she was the mother of the strange child, and she was the mother who had to suffer all of that. And she was holy to begin with, but for the rest of us, obviously, we would end up holy to some degree.
Yes. Amal, you fled a war in the Middle East. Your family came to Europe. You were moved from not just country, but from continent, from culture to something very radically different from what you knew. How did that impact on your spiritual development?
It was, I don't know, I think that it was for me an adventure. I've always seen it as an adventure. I don't know if it was the same for my mother, of course, but you know, if you come from a tradition where you have people who have been persecuted, even in your own country, and you have been displaced. I mean, you know, like as I said, you know, like I've mentioned it a few times, not today, but in other interviews and also writings. The only thing that I remember from the last, you know, like when I was still in Iraq, in the period of 20 years before I was born and during I was, in like when I was a teenager, again, my family lost their house twice. So my aunt, who is now in her 60, she said that she, you know, like really coming to Belgium was, I think, the fifth time that she had to leave her place and resettle. So it is, when you hear something like that, in a way, you know, like it's really breaking. But at the same time, I was lucky enough to have someone like my grandmother and, you know, my family, my mother, of course, and dad died when we were little.
Yes.
But just to tell you, you know, like I think that it is Christian faith. We are not, of course, we love our country. We pray for, you know, like president, king, prime minister, whatever. But we are not attached to a land. You know, like my religion is not a land. I can be a Christian anywhere.
Yes.
And I remember reading this. I can't exactly tell you which passage it was in the Bible, but I think there is one passage when people are telling the Jews, I think it was in Babylon, to go back. And I don't know which prophet is saying, I mean, what God is telling people, no, stay here, marry, work for this country, because that's what God wants for you. Yes. So for me, in a way, I've always seen it as an opportunity to serve God and to learn more about other people. Of course, you miss your country, you miss your culture, you miss it is something that, and I had to leave so many things behind, yes. Really precious things. But at the same time, I think it's a sort of, you know, like it's a process of gaining other things. You are always, what I remember when we were leaving Iraq, my grandmother said something very, I mean, she was not only a poet, but she was very, very wise, a really woman of faith. She said, you know, like when you move a stone from its place, it's not going to be as fixed as it was before. You know, it will be lighter afterwards to move it around, you know. And she told me, you will arrive there exactly what you were telling me now. My gosh, it's the exact words. And they said, you know, they don't know who you are, or your family is, the history of your family is. So you are just a stranger there, you know, like they don't know you, but don't worry. I'll be praying and I'll give a special blessing for anyone who will be on your way and give you, you know, like a helping hand. Yes. So that's what I remember as a stranger. And this is what I try to do also for other strangers, or foreigners or immigrants. We really don't know the story behind. I'm sure that there are many cases that you just think they shouldn't be here. But I remember reading about someone, an Iraqi who is now a presenter in Germany. I think that if we see that person, you know, walking the street, you just think, I don't want to be with him, you know, like in the same street in the evening. Once you hear his story, what happened to him, how much his family suffered, and why he had to flee Iraq, my goodness, you know, like I was with tears in my eyes, and I just thought, how hard could we be? You know, I could have been treating that person horribly, yes, without realizing that I was really, you know, treating Jesus in the most horrible way, like it was like the slap that you give on his face, yes, without realizing that you are slapping Jesus. And I think that sometimes we can treat people like that. And I hope that we will never find ourselves, you know, like we don't have to be naive, but also I prefer to err on the side of goodness than to be unjust. And, you know, as I said, you know, give that slap on the face of someone who would turn afterwards to be Christ.
Do either of you or both of you, I mean, the whole passage, you mentioned it, Amal, the stranger, you know, we are supposed to be strangers in a strange land. I mean, that's what St. Paul sees us as Christians. Do you think there's something in the immigrant experience which kind of pushes us closer to Christ, you know, that we're not so reliant? I mean, the way you were describing your experience, Amal, it was almost like a liberation from, I mean, as much as we love our history and our culture and our family, there's a kind of being tested in the fire, where things are being burnt off. Is that something of either of your experience?
I think so. I mean, for me, certainly, it is a question of coming free from all of those kind of cultural cultural affirmations, because when you're in your own country and you're constantly understood, and you're going up you're going down the well-worn path that your parents went down and your grandparents went down, and people have known you for years, and your reality is reflected on the TV. I think things are fairly easy. But when you're a stranger, as I say, then you're constantly challenged and you're constantly kind of worn down, and you have to exist in the gaze of God. And ditto, it's about not judging people, as Amal was saying. I mean, when people's command of the language isn't absolutely 100% and plus, it's very easy to judge people wrongly.
Yes.
When we see immigrants on the street, and in Italy, it's all about selling the socks or trying to wash the windscreen at the traffic lights, and we know nothing of what those people are. And I mean, my husband and I always try and make a point of asking, where are you from and what did you do in your country? And often they're very, very high level professional people, and just fallen on incredibly hard times. So yeah, it's a sobering thing, immigration, but I think it's good for the soul, and good for the soul of a country if we can welcome people.
So in terms of Europe, women, immigration, where we go from here, if I were to ask either of you, what's the one sign of hope that you see at the moment in very turbulent times? There's a health crisis that's dominating all the world, but Europe in particular. There's economic crises coming in one shape or another. There's the movements of people and various other things which are causing friction across the continent. Can you point to anything, somebody watching this somewhere, maybe in America or elsewhere, where you would say, I think this is a sign of hope in Europe today?
I still think that, the hope is Our Lady. All these immigrants, they love, or most of them, they love Our Lady. And I think that Our Lady is going to play an even greater role in the future, because she will be the one uniting element between all these different cultures and even religious backgrounds. So, I'll go back again to Our Lady, St. Joseph. And again, you can't think of Our Lady and St. Joseph without thinking of Jesus, but the real Jesus, not the, I think that we have to present the real Jesus to people, because, many people don't know the real Jesus. Honestly, they don't know him, and this is a tragedy. This is the greatest tragedy. I think that not only in Europe but everywhere. We think that we know him, but we don't know him. We have to go back to and have that simplicity that I've seen in my grandmother and mother and all these fantastic women, and even Our Lady. It was really her simplicity and that childlike faith and trust in God that made her so open to God and to receive the real Jesus, basically. So for me, I can't go and I can't offer any other sign of hope than to say Our Lady.
Sally, what about you?
I would point people to the latest beatification of the Blessed Carlo Acutis,
Yes.
who's lying in Assisi, and who was 15 years old,
Yes.
and he died in, I think, it was 2005, I believe. And he had a great devotion to the Eucharist. And I think just the enormous passion that he felt for Christ and for the Eucharist in his short life.
That's right.
And the fact that he wasn't even raised in a particularly devout family. I mean, his parents became religious as a result of him.
That's right.
The fact he was taken so young, and the fact of the work that he did, and the fact that he's been beatified now in this year of COVID, when we're so reliant on technology, and he's going to be the patron saint of the internet, I think.
That's right.
I think, the church always throws up these signs of hope and these new saints, when we most need them. And there's no question that God has not abandoned us, and we just have to have faith and trust and pray and pray and pray. Never, never, never stop praying and never stop hoping, because he will not abandon us.
Well, I think that's a wonderful point at which to allow the Euro Express to come into its terminus. And I'd like to thank you, Sally, in Rome, and you, Amal, in Brussels, for being such wonderful passengers on this train and having such a wonderful conversation. And I do hope that you will buy return tickets and once more board the Euro Express. So from Our Lady's Shrine here at Walsingham, goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.